3, 2, 1.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at, and welcome to the NCSL webinar, the ADA's Impact on Accessible Legislatures. My name is Wendy Madsen, and I am the Special Projects Manager for the Wyoming Legislative Service Office, and I'm going to be moderating our seminar today. I'd first like to thank the National Conference of State Legislatures for sponsoring this webinar. One of the purposes of NCSL is promoting professional development opportunities such as this. And especially in the days of COVID, these opportunities are very welcome, and NCSL is a fantastic leader in providing remote training, so I encourage you to take advantage of that. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be archived on the NCSL website. So over the next 60 minutes, we encourage you to participate through our chat box. It's located in the lower left-hand side of your screen. And to build some comfort up for this service, we'd like to have you enter the state you're participating in from today and just play around a little bit with the chat box for a minute. So feel free to enter your state in now so we can see where you are participating from. And feel free at any time to answer questions in for our speakers, and we will also have a question and answer period at the end of everyone's presentation. I also want to take a minute to talk about the services that we have on your screen. You can find a couple of tabs. There's one labeled Resources at the top of your screen, and you can find a PDF version of this PowerPoint and other handouts. There's also a tab named Speakers, and this is where you can read short bios on each of our speakers today. And then you also can see a survey information at the end. So go ahead, and we're going to get started. We have 4 speakers today. I'll start us off, and then we have David Hart and Paul Brown from MOCA, and Kevin Koch from Texas. So one of the things I am really excited to talk to you about is Wyoming's restoration. And as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's a great time to take a look at our state capitals around the country. And so we're going to look today at a few different capitals and what they've done to make their buildings more accessible. In Wyoming, we just celebrated the reopening of our capitol about a year ago on July 10th, and the building reopened after a 4-year, $300 million restoration. And that restoration was overseen by a group called the Capitol Oversight Group, which was comprised of our governor, treasurer, and members of legislative leadership. And they focused extensively during this restoration project on addressing life safety issues, building system issues, and inadequate space for the public to participate in policymaking in the process. And part of that focus was on bringing the building up to ADA standards. The building was non-compliant in a number of ways. It was also very dangerous, no fire suppression systems at all. But as we reopened the Capitol and throughout the restoration, the oversight group really focused on the building as the people's house. And throughout that 4-year period, the focus was really about how do you make this building more and more about the people of Wyoming. And so the opening celebrations included the tagline of the people's house. And so it got me thinking, for today's purposes, what does it really mean to be the people's house? And for background for all of you, I am not an architect. I'm a political science major, and so being involved in this restoration was a joy of a lifetime, and I learned a tremendous amount about buildings and restoration in the ADA, but I am not an ADA expert. I have a lot of focus on public participation in the process, and so I wanted to focus a little bit today on what does it mean truly to be the people's house. And so around the country, and you can all think of your Capitol, this is our newly restored Capitol, the Capitol buildings are truly the physical manifestation of our representative democracies. They are basically the embodiment of public policy in our state. And they really exist for that purpose. And I think it's really important to think about who they exist for. Do they exist for some of the people or all of the people? And how do we make everybody feel included? And so I wanted to just share with you a few stories about people. And the first story is a story about my niece, Niana. And Niana was born profoundly deaf in both ears, and she received cochlear implants at 14 months of age. Now, cochlear implants have been a wonderful, life-changing thing for Niana. She can hear and does not only have to sign, she can hear around her. However, if there's ambient noise or people whispering or talking, hearing is still very often a challenge for her, as it is for many people with hearing aids or folks who are just hard of hearing. So for Niana to participate in public policy as she grows older, when we were doing this restoration, I thought about her a lot. And one of the incredible things about our project is we have 10 large public meeting rooms. And those meeting rooms, in addition to our chamber galleries, all include a hearing loop system that exists under the carpet. And what that system does is allow people like Niana or anyone with a hearing aid to come into the room, and that hearing loop automatically can connect to her cochlear implants. She doesn't have to feel any different than anybody else. She can come into the room and participate. In addition to the hearing loop, we also have the ability, if you're hard of hearing and you don't have hearing aids, to check out an amplification device. And so that's just one story about how we can help people fully participate in the process. Another story I want to tell you is about my friend Mike Hayes. Mike has been a long-term lobbyist at the Wyoming Legislature, and he works for the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs of Police. And Mike has been in a wheelchair for many, many years. And Mike was just an incredible resource along the way, both prior to the restoration and even during the restoration, constantly asking me in our temporary building about different issues he had encountered along the way. And I really think it's important to kind of put yourself in other folks' shoes. And we all, over our lives and the seasons of our lives, have different issues that come up. And I love the idea of universal design that Paul and David are going to be talking about more in a little while, because really the goal of making buildings accessible is that we want to make it so it's easy for everyone to use the building. And one of the things that I think is so important for folks like Mike is they should not have to go out of their way to participate in the same process. And so Mike told me a story that I wanted to share with you all about what it was like in the building before the restoration. And Wyoming's legislative sessions are very short. They are only 40 days long in a general session and 20 days long in a budget session. And so we have committee meetings that start at 7 a.m. each day. They go over lunch, and then they occur upon adjournment every weekday during session. Those meetings on adjournment can run as late as 10 p.m. And so Mike told a story about his longest day ever. He came at 6:30, and the reason he had to come at 6:30 was to make sure he could navigate through the building and get a seat in our very small meeting rooms. And he said that he did not leave the building until 11:23 p.m., had to get back to his vehicle, And he said at that point he had a manual wheelchair and he had to go up and down throughout the building all day. And I'm about to show you some pictures about that. And he said in his very Western way, Wendy, by the time I left that building, I was whooped. And so I wanted to just show you a few slides of what Mike had to go through prior to the restoration of our building. The first thing Mike would have encountered is a set of ramps, very unattractive ramps, I might add, that would take him into the main floor of the building. He also, as he came into the building and at different points throughout the day, had to navigate different handicapped lifts in the building. This is one lift that goes down into a major hearing room. He would have to get on that lift. It was very slow and clunky, and then get off the lift at the top. He also had to get on another lift by the time he got up to the gallery level to observe floor sessions of both the House and Senate. He would have to get on another lift, and that lift only existed outside the House chamber. Both our House gallery and our Senate galleries had a series of about 5 stairs. So we only had one lift in the building, so Mike would have to crisscross from east to west and back again to get on different elevators because we only had one lift. Once Mike got through all those places, he would encounter a small room like this. Members would sit around the table for their hearing and the public would sit behind. Oftentimes what Mike would encounter is people already in the room, so he had to leave even earlier to get a spot in the room. Mike was going to retire as a lobbyist last year, and he decided to stay on one more year just to see what it was like to lobby in the restored building. And it was great to talk to him. He said just how much easier it is for him to get around. He said it's not complicated. He can get anywhere he needs to quickly and easily. And so I just wanted to show you a couple of after photos. That same picture I showed you with the ugly ramp now has what's called a universal design ramp that David and Paul are going to talk about more in a minute. And that is just a nice, gentle sloping walkway. It does not need rails on it. What I find, this is the view directly out my office window, what I find is no one's taking the stairs anymore. They're coming from a parking lot and everyone is walking this path, which is just a really great way to not make anybody feel different in the process. This ramp is not only practical, it's aesthetically very beautiful. You can see the walk here out one of our windows of one of our major hearing rooms. It's gorgeous. It's just a pleasant place with beautiful landscaping. The other thing Mike would encounter when he gets at the top of that is now that path leads up to the first floor of our buildings. We also have pathways in at the garden level of our building, but this leads right to the first floor rotunda. We also have changed out all door handles from round handles to lever handles. That's useful for all sorts of people. I find levers easy when I have a bunch of stuff in my hands to just be able to push down with my elbow on that lever, so they have tremendous amount of uses. The other incredible thing that happened as part of our restoration is public space was reclaimed. Over time in this building, there was so much demand for space that in these beautiful public corridors that have been restored, other needs would encroach on them, whether it be elevators or conference rooms, and pretty soon what you found was just a maze of little hallways. Steps were added over time. There'd be steps and ramps and just a lot of unnecessary impediments in the way of folks trying to get to the chamber. This is our House lobby. It now has, you can see the accessible path to our elevator corridor. There are no obstructions in the way. And one of the things that Kevin's going to talk about is how you keep a building accessible years and years after a restoration. and he'll talk about how Texas has done that. But one of the things I noticed when our session started is this is the path to our elevators. It is the accessible path. And pretty soon, folks would start putting a chair here and there. And I think for any of you who staff or are building managers and capitals, it's imperative to kind of sweep with your eyes the building to see where possible impediments may exist and remove those. The stairs that I showed you in an earlier picture that had the lift outside of them are now also the wide historic corridors, and we no longer have separate handicapped lifts in the building. I think this is the most elegant mobility solution as part of our restoration. We now have an elevator on both the east and west side that has a rear door. And that elevator allows you to get in at this top level, go all the way to every floor down to the garden level, or just down to the lower third. And that is really elegant way to treat everybody equally in this building. And then finally, Mike, when he goes into a meeting room, he no longer has to show up 30 minutes earlier than everybody else because all of our meeting rooms are large. They have ADA reserved spaces for mobility. They have the hearing loops, and we also have a number of accommodations for visual impairments throughout the building. So to conclude, I think it's important in every aspect of our building, we've been able to find ways. This is another set of elevators rather than lifts that individuals can take to get to another entire level of our building that has public meeting rooms. And I think it's important as I get ready to conclude and introduce our next speakers to talk about not only ways that we can meet the ADA in our buildings, but also truly embrace that this is the people's house and it exists for all the people. And we can do it in a beautiful and elegant way. And I think that's a great way for me to move on and introduce our next speakers. Our next speakers are from an organization called MOCA. And I had the privilege of working with both David Hart and Paul Brown on the Wyoming restoration. They served as the program managers of the project, and many of the incredible solutions that you see in my presentation were brainchilds of both David and Paul. And I'm going to turn it over to them now to speak to you about not only the Wyoming Capitol restoration, but several other restorations they were involved in, and some of the exciting changes that are happening right now in the world of universal design. So David and Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. We appreciate the opportunity to be here. And as Wendy mentioned, we're program managers and owners representatives. And so we typically have been involved in setting up, organizing, and then managing the selection process for architects and contractors, and then kind of working through the process. You can see here, this is Paul Brown's experience, and you saw mine just a minute ago. We wanted to talk a little bit about how ADA has changed state capitol restorations, and we wanted to do that, we'd like to do that over a discussion about timing, and we're going to use state capitals that we've been involved in to try and express that. But first, we thought it would be really important to talk a little bit about symbols and the importance of those symbols and how those impact us a little bit. And I think the thing that's important about these buildings is that they're a modern building with modern functions, but they're patterned after ancient temples. And the elements come typically from classical architecture. They denote a permanence or a symbol of enduring democracy. There is a formality to the buildings. They're usually formally organized and have a clear classical form. There is a hierarchy that's very, very important to keep in mind and important to maintain as you go through, and the planning is based upon these hierarchical principles that were originally involved in the projects. Democracy, there's expression of our democratic values, checks, balances, the open debate. You heard Wendy mention that it's the people's house, and it's a symbolic representation of our Constitution and the values as Americans that we hold dear. And then open spaces symbolize the openness to the public, commonly referred to, as Wendy mentioned, the people's house. I'd like then to turn some time over to Paul to talk a little bit about some of these design principles that I think are very important as we begin the discussion about how you modify or impact state capital to make them accessible to everyone. Paul?
Thanks, Dave. These general components of the building type may not apply to all of state capitals throughout the country, but many of them do have some of these or all of these components. The first is a podium, which is a platform upon which the building rests. It sort of levels the ground and sets the building up, which is a challenge, sets the building up as an important part of the environment in which it sits. In other words, it's up for prominence. The second is there's a procession along, usually a long, imposing stair to the main entrance of the building, where the grand space is first encountered. And there's a hierarchy to those spaces. Spaces were elevated to express their importance, one space over another. And many of these buildings contain or are organized around what architects call a piano nobile. It's Italian meaning the noble level, usually the first level above the ground, and that is the level where the rotunda usually occurs, or the most dramatic rotunda space occurs. These are ceremonial-driven spaces. They're always up on a prominent site, Capitol buildings are, and there's usually an axial organization of the building spaces, usually on cardinal axes, north, south, east, and west. The reason that we mention this is because most of these commonalities, or most of these elements of these important public buildings, the People's House, present challenges for access. Obviously, during the time that these buildings were originally designed, access was not exactly considered the way we consider it today. And so what we want to spend some time talking about is how these ideas have evolved over time from complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act 30 years ago to actually moving onward to what has commonly been called universal design. So we'll talk about that as we move forward.
So then the question becomes how to modify the buildings and retain these principles. If we were to go in and just scrape out the buildings and put in new everything and disregard these principles, that the buildings would be less than what they were originally. And some of the original designers, such as Cass Gilbert and many other famous architects, a lot of those principles would be lost, as well as would a lot of the benefit or the importance, ceremonial aspects of the Capitol. So one of the things that we try to do is study the original architect's drawings and designs very carefully, look for solutions that would have, that the architect, the original architect, not the new architect or the restoration architect, but the original architect would have proposed. In other words, kind of climb inside the head of the original architect. Many times we find also that these buildings are smaller than are needed, or the space is smaller than is really required, and so an addition or an extension of the Capitol is important. And we find that utilizing those extensions to try to solve the problems of associated with circulation and accessibility is beneficial. And then the whole idea of moving beyond the law. 30 years ago, the law was, 30, 40 years ago, the law was enacted. And since that time, at the beginning, we spent a lot of time just trying to accommodate the law. And over time, we have come to understand that we really should be looking more at universal access so that everybody has the same access for the people's house. And we'll try to demonstrate that over the next little bit. So the first building is the Utah State Capitol, and this was restored. The restoration actually started, the planning and study actually started in 1999, and it actually went into construction in 2004 and completed in 2008. And this is an example of where we were just basically trying to comply and bring back a lot of the principles that Richard Kledding had originally put into the building. One of the things that Kledding had originally identified, which they didn't build initially around the Capitol, was a podium. We were able to use that podium, as you see here in the photographs, to allow us to bring people up to the first level, not all the way up to the piano nobile level, as Paul was talking, which is the area because of the number of stairs. You can see the grand staircase identified there. But we had to figure out a way to bring people in stages into this building because, again, we were just trying to comply with ADA. And so the podium became this wonderful leveling device, but it also gave us the opportunity to hide some of the elements. Of course, we also had to deal with the deeply recessed door jambs, and we were able to work with the code officials to receive a waiver on having to widen the doors. And because of the historic exceptions, you're able to ask for those things. We did redesign many of the door handles so that we had the lever hardware, which was approved by ADA. Elevator access was important. We provided a number of paths of travel through the space. Even these two gravel pathways that you see there, we actually had the Disability Law Center come out and review with us and give us some advice on how those paths could become accessible to people so that they were not just for able-bodied, but they were for everyone. And the last thing that I think is important to talk about with regards to the Utah State Capitol, because we were kind of venturing into some unknown territory, we spent a lot of time talking to the different resource centers for ADA and getting advice and asking them questions, and they were tremendously helpful. One of the things that they helped us with was understanding how to try to provide for these raised dioceses, or in this case, the Supreme Court room, which had a higher level for the justices. Now, we had a justice at that time who was in a wheelchair, and we needed to provide a way for that justice to utilize the Supreme Court dais. The solution that we came up with, again, remember, we were looking for a way to meet the requirements, was that the stairs could be disconnected or taken away. They were flexible, and a lift could be brought in, and then he could go up and down. And because they only used this as a ceremonial chamber periodically, that was an acceptable solution for ADA use. And so that was kind of the beginning point for Paul and I in studying and trying to understand how to implement some of these principles of ADA into buildings. With that, I'll turn some time over to Paul to talk about Idaho.
So we were involved in some of the very early planning in the Idaho Capitol restoration and expansion, and the expansion added multiple public access hearing rooms on lower levels. And we also, in that early planning, very carefully considered how visitors might arrive and how visitor groups might gain access. And the Idaho Capitol is similar to other buildings of this type, where the piano nobile, or the main floor, is up a steep flight of stairs that face south, and then beneath those stairs is a porte cochere, which was initially a drive-through, And then this sketch shows a door into the lower level, or what they called the garden level, which became an accessible path to the visitor center. So all the visitors' functions happened in this garden level. And so we started to move toward using walkways instead of ramps. And let me explain the difference between those two. So a ramp in the code means that the slope cannot exceed 1 foot in 12 and has to be accompanied by handrails and have a landing that's the same length as the width of the walk or thereabouts for every 30 inches of grade change. And so that becomes sort of a very important element on the landscape, because you have these rails and the ramp goes flat, then it goes up, and it's a little bit difficult architecturally, and it also sort of designates that area as a wheelchair ramp, to use the old language that we used to use when the law first came out. And then as we started to think about this a little bit more, we started to think about what David's mentioned, and that is that it would be really great if these things didn't feel like a ramp, they just felt like a walk. And so a walk, on the other hand, can slope 1 foot in 20 feet and does not need to have a railing or a landing. So it can just provide a universal smooth slope. So when we get to Wyoming, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then those hearing rooms below grade were obviously a great public access experience, and they were obviously accessible too. And then elevator use in the building was expanded also. And then on to Minnesota. Dave, do you want me to chat a little bit about this one?
Yeah, why don't you start with that?
So in Minnesota, there's a very unique challenge, and it is that the chambers, including the Supreme Court chamber, the House and the Senate, are all elevated about 3 steps up from the floor of the circulation path that runs around the rotunda. So access to the chambers was a little bit difficult because they're so architecturally significant in their prominence and in the way they step up for architectural importance. And so one of the things that we had to figure out is how to get people into these spaces where they were elevated. And this example is one that is simply compliance. And we'll talk a little bit about this. If you can see the little arrow that runs around the left-hand side of those colored areas and then goes up a ramp with an arrow to it, this is the public seating area in the Supreme Court chamber. And we were able to utilize some spaces that were not prominent in the room, but allowed access up to that level sort of through a back corridor. The back corridor was actually very beautiful. It was one of their auxiliary corridors, but the route was a little bit circuitous and a little bit difficult. Did comply, made everything work, but was still a ramp, I guess, in the purest sense. So Dave, I don't know if you want to talk more about some of the other rooms.
Sure. Anyhow, we did work to provide, as Wendy was saying, T-coils and hearing assistance, and obviously Braille was included in that. The other thing that was very important in Minnesota was that they struggled to meet several different levels. That when you came into the building, it immediately stepped down, then it stepped back up, and then you went up a flight of stairs, and then it had, again, a couple of different level changes, especially to the different chambers. But one of the big problems was trying to address how to move people in and out of the building at the very bottom level, the basement level, or the garden. I guess in this case you'd call it the garden level. And so what we had to do is identify a place where we could put an elevator that would allow people to both move in, use the elevator to go up and down, and so it became more of an ability to get people to different locations or allow people to move to different locations in a more natural flow rather than to force them in a circuitous ramp and up and down other areas, which was there when we started. When we started the restoration, they had several temporary or wooden ramps, which had become permanent over time, to move people in and around these different level changes. And we found a location, and you can see these elevators that have been in the upper two slide photos, where we were able to find a location that went all the way through the building that allowed people to come in, use that elevator to hit just about every level possible, and so we were able to eliminate all of those ramps. And then at the outset at the front, I'll have Paul talk a little bit about what we did to the exterior. And so this allowed us to address that. The other thing that was important in Minnesota was not every space was accessible. Some of the spaces had very high thresholds, and the doors were historic that sat above those thresholds, but you had to step up and over the threshold, which was somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 18 inches high. And that was done, obviously, to address water issues. So we had to find a way to lower the threshold, as you can see the picture with the door open, lower the threshold, allow people to walk out onto this balcony, but at the same time address the water issues so that it didn't come back into the building. And so there's a lot of technical work that has to go into sometimes making these spaces accessible. Restrooms, of course, are absolutely critical. We try very hard to utilize the original designs of the architect, the original architect in the design of the restrooms. We then try to find locations or places where we can install the appropriate toilet facility or elements that need to go into the space to allow for the person in a wheelchair or a person in some other situation able to address the area. We try to very carefully use the same material and the same finishes so that there is no real change in the overall appearance within the area. We talked earlier about trying to use extension buildings to help solve some of the circulation issues between locations. This is an example in Minnesota where we actually had the opportunity to lower a portion of the majority of the space underneath the Capitol, a couple of inches or feet in some areas, so that we could make the ramps between the different buildings work a little better below grade. Minnesota has an underground connective loop that ties their campus together. And by adjusting some space in the basement of the Minnesota Capitol, we were able to make a better circulation path to and from all of the buildings through these tunnels that were accessible. Paul, why don't you talk for a minute about the exterior, and then we'll move on to Wyoming.
Yeah, so I'll be brief here. The grading on the exterior was a bit difficult for the Minnesota Capitol, and we were able to remake the avenue that was in front of the Capitol for accessibility, and also gain accessibility through the porte cochere under the south steps. This only got you to the lower level. Next slide, maybe, Dave. In Wyoming, this is the condition that Wendy showed before, and we won't spend much time on the image here, but what's important about Wyoming is that this system allowed us to have a universal path to the piano nobile in this building. So we were able to, on this north side, be able to gather enough elevation to be able to use a walkway, not a ramp, but a walkway to get to that main level, the level one, the big rotunda space. And so that was a very important step. And I won't touch on these other things because Wendy's already talked about those. But I think maybe we just advance to what we're now working toward for universal design. This is a couple of sketches from work that we started to do on Missouri. where we actually regrade much of the site and provide an extension building that is all based on universal design getting into the building, where all folks walk or roll the same path and all entrances work that way for this extension and for getting into the Capitol. Maybe next, Dave, and we can talk a little bit about California.
Okay. So in California, one of the things that they have really embraced is this idea about universal design, where all visitors follow the same path. And so you can see here in this little elevation study is we are using a universal ramp or a universal walk to go subterranean and to allow for a west entry below the main entry of the Capitol. This also allows us to gently slope the sides and to bring people in, but everybody gets the same experience. And then once in the building, the ability for them to move up and into the Capitol, while we're still using ramps because of the limited amount of space, they are in the same area with those that are walking and using the stairs. With regards to the east side of the building, part of the project that we're doing now is to remove the annex and to replace that. And again, the principle of universal design applies. And Paul, do you want to talk a little bit about the ideas that are driving the work towards the east side?
I can. I think we need to be pretty quick. The big idea is that all the public meeting spaces are on a level that is actually adjusted on the site to be a walk-in, so there's no grade change to access all of the public meeting rooms, which is the biggest part of this work is gaining access to those. And so the idea is to first locate public meeting rooms where they are accessible and then provide a universal access system to have all the public who come to those meetings and to engage there
right.
actually welcome.
Right. And then the last thing we wanted to talk about, and then we'll turn the time over to Kevin, is the fact that we're trying to make sure the floors line up. Presently in the building, the floors do not line up, and so there is little accessibility for those who are mobility challenged to move from the historic building into the annex building. And so with that, we'll turn the time over to our next speaker, Kevin.
All right.
Great. Good day, everybody.
Oh, go ahead. Go right ahead, Kevin. I just wanted to introduce you as the architect of the Texas Capitol, and Kevin's got great experience from a building that's been restored several years ago and modifications along the way. Take it away, Kevin.
Great. Good day, everybody. It's great to be here with you to share some of our experiences here in Texas. I'm architect of the Capitol, responsible for overseeing preservation, capital improvements, and ADA compliance at our Capitol and a few key associated buildings. I'd like to talk about our restoration 25 years ago, addressing ADA issues post-restoration as part of facilities management, and share with you a recent accessibility improvement we've completed. Some quick background. Our Capitol was completed in 1888 by Elijah Myers, who also designed Michigan and Colorado Capitols. Has 360,000 square feet, which housed virtually all of state government at the time it was built, with some room to spare. The Capitol had grown overcrowded as the state government grew over the next century, and construction had happened in a piecemeal fashion, as has been discussed, within the historic building to fit in more people, and it resulted in some crowded and unsafe conditions. There was a fire in 1983 that often happens to historic buildings to kind of trigger some special attention, and that started the path toward a major restoration, which was completed in 1995. And with that was the creation of the State Preservation Board to focus specifically on the very unique needs of a historic restoration of a Capitol, and then its ongoing maintenance and preservation. One of the key features of the restoration project were our large rooms were opened back up to their original large historic size, and then subdivided back into functional offices with partitions that had wooden lower walls and glass upper walls. That allowed the new construction within the old that still allowed the historic volumes to read and allowed us to incorporate air conditioning and coffee bars and storage into the spaces without impacting the historic structure. Along with the restoration, an underground extension was built. It was contiguous with the Capitol. You can see this cross section that shows how there were tunnels dug under the historic Capitol, which allowed the historic elevators in the Capitol to drop down into the extension level. Just some ADA notes about the restoration and extension. Both of these were registered under a 1979 law in Texas called the Elimination of Architectural Barriers Act, because the early design had started right before the ADA came into effect. But the decision was made to design to the ADA. So some of the accessible features of the restoration: in general, the large, gracious historic spaces were opened back up, making the building much easier to navigate than it was before. The new subdivision of the large spaces I described allowed for ADA compliance within the new offices with all new doors and partitions, so our approaches could be accessible. We were fortunate that our recessed historic doors swung into the rooms, and so we didn't have an issue with those. Lifts were provided at every primary entrance to the chambers and galleries, as has been discussed as issues in other capitals. Accessible seating was provided there. Our building had elevators in 1888, which helped a lot. We didn't have any problems finding vertical space to add those. And the tunnels I mentioned that were dug underneath to tie those historic elevator locations into the new Capitol made the building fully accessible as one facility. The extension doubled our space and helped us accommodate the space limitations that resulted from opening back up the historic spaces. And the extension was all new construction, so that was easily made accessible. One of our biggest challenges was creating an accessible entrance, as has been discussed at other capitals, and providing accessible routes to those, which I'll discuss later. And there's a picture in the upper right of our accessible entrance. The north entrance was chosen for multiple reasons. The building is built on the edge of a plateau overlooking the river, which you can see in that left photo. And it's had a much greater grade changes. The entrance at the north is actually a projecting portico, so we're able to enter it from the side. The smaller deck was easier to raise up to be flush with the interior floors. And as you can see, we did a pretty good job, way back then with gentle slopes, not requiring handrails for a large part of the distance. The rails were only required at the bridge, which passes over a lower side entrance. And there are stairs there to the left as well, which makes it a universal feature, accessible to everyone. Kind of going beyond the buildings, here's some aerial photos. At its founding and initial survey in 1839, the location was allotted for the Capitol at the center of Austin on Capitol Square, which is surrounded by state land. And the grounds are really an integral historic part of the Capitol's presence. It sets it off from downtown with graceful park-like surroundings and really gives the building some presence. The grounds were restored in 1996, shortly after the building restoration. As you can see in this plan, the grounds have a symmetrical design, but the thinner lines there you see are our sidewalks, and those were actually designed along footpaths that had existed previously. It's just where people walked because it was the most level slope, and that's where the sidewalks were added, and it gave the site a free-flowing organic design and resulted in a lot of sinuous paths crossing through the acres, 22 acres, which I'll discuss in a bit. Most of those sidewalks were largely accessible. There was a minor regrading that happened to make sure they were accessible throughout their length. And at the time, we had accessible parking next to our north entrance here, and our primary pedestrian entrance was at the south with a route to the north entrance. So that's a little bit about our restoration. But after the restoration, time marches on, and the work did not end. Maintaining a building is as important as doing a proper restoration. I'd mentioned the Capitol had previously grown overcrowded kind of in a piecemeal fashion, and one of the most important functions of the State Preservation Board and the benefits of the restoration was the creation of the board to help prevent this from happening again by managing change properly. One of the most important aspects, our board consists of the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker of the House, a representative from the House and Senate, and a public member appointed by the governor. Because the State Preservation Board includes leadership from all of our occupants, led by the governor with the lieutenant governor and House Speaker as co-vice chairs, capital decisions about improvements and changes are made with a unified voice, and project management is conducted consistently throughout the building. The changes will never be haphazard. So that would be takeaway number one, to make sure you involve all your leadership in a unified voice to manage change. We're also required by law to retain all of our documentation related to restoration and subsequent work. This is very helpful, so that would be a takeaway too, that I would suggest that you hold on to all your building records, because we're digging into them often, even though they're 30 years old. And we have our staff, which is dedicated solely to the Capitol and a few key supporting buildings. Facilities management program with this kind of focus is able to handle the unique requirements of the Capitol environment. One of our primary functions is preservation. Any requested changes to the building must be approved by the board and is presented with recommendations for our staff. So again, changes have levels of approval required, which and review, which really help manage change over time. A few ADA notes about work since the restoration. While changes under $50,000 are not required for review by our local state agency, we have in-house expertise to make sure that not even the smallest changes are made that impact ADA compliance. Another takeaway I would give you is to encourage you to have someone on staff, if you don't have dedicated facilities management, just to have someone who's in the building on a regular basis who's familiar with the ADA. It doesn't have to be an architect, and it's really not that scary. If you can just send someone who's in charge of walking through the spaces and noticing when furniture is placed in the wrong way, that's very important. And minor maintenance items like making sure doors have 5 pounds of pull pressure, and when bathroom accessories are replaced, that they're mounted at the right height. The small things like that make a big difference to your visitors. So now 25 years after our restoration, we've undertaken a few larger renovation projects. And one key thing to know is anytime there's an alteration made to an area of primary activity in your building, that triggers inspections and requires upgrades of any non-ADA compliant elements in restrooms, drinking fountains, accessible routes serving the space. And you're required to allocate up to 20% of your construction budget to address those things. So I'd encourage you to think about that in the early planning phases of any of your projects. One of the examples of this is we recently renovated an office, and the drinking fountain associated with it was compliant to the 1991 ADA standards, but the new standards out in 2010 have a specific height for the standing height drinking fountain to prevent people from stooping. And so we were required to convert that into a high-low, and being a bronze fountain and being integrated with plumbing into a historic building, that was no small feat. So it's one of the little details that can turn into a larger part of the projects that you need to consider in advance. So moving on to some other, in addition to ADA changing and needing to keep on top of that, you can have conditions change as well. After our restoration in 1999, we had a visitors parking garage that was completed a block east of Capitol Square. And then in 2001, the grounds were restricted to vehicular traffic, which removed our public accessible parking that was right next to the building, making this our primary accessible facility, which is on an accessible route to the building. So this is a good time to talk about outreach. So Austin has an active disability rights community, and we have the Preservation Board has a long history of proactive interaction with these advocacy groups. For example, we brought some in when we were designing the Texas State History Museum to have early reviews to make sure our exhibits were accessible as possible. So in 2014, we approached a group called the Coalition of Texans with Disabilities, asking for input to guide our priorities as we planned our capital improvements in the future. And they were able to interview their constituency and get feedback. And people living with disabilities have a different experience of the world, and they're really the best ones to tell you what the barriers are to them above and beyond the ADA. And they came back to us with a list of issues that they have had, and we found actually that many of these issues could be handled by improving our signage. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about our wayfinding project, which is one of the improvements that we made. to address their concerns. And I'm pointing out here, we also have our Capitol Visitor Center, which is a small building at the corner of, historic building at the corner of our grounds. And we have our surrounding buildings to serve around Capitol Square that parking garage serves. So when we're looking at wayfinding, improving wayfinding was one of the main issues, that when you arrive at the parking garage, you know, that accessible route can be kind of hard to find. And so we started out by checking every single one of our sidewalks, running slope, side slope, which is a good thing to do in general, because over time your trees can heave your sidewalks and bring formerly compliant sidewalks out of compliance. And then we did an extensive examination of who's arriving, where they need to go, where the routes are, where the barriers are. And then we kind of broke it down into where people are coming from, our main side entrances here, our primary building entrances, our Capitol and our Visitor Center, and the primary route between the visitors parking, and not only that, but to all the pedestrian entrances around, identifying those accessible routes. And then we expanded it then to look at the accessible entrances to our surrounding buildings around Capitol Square and the routes to those. And as you can see, if you're arriving and you're not familiar with the location and trying to get from point A to point B, it can be pretty confusing. So the primary tool that we had in our wayfinding signage program was this wayfinding map, which when it's full size in front of you, you can see all the detail. We have our primary accessible routes to our primary buildings, and then how to get to the accessible entrance of every building around Capitol Square. And these were presented a number of ways. One is a welcome kiosk at our parking garage, which also includes some larger wayfinding arrows to get you to our primary buildings, and some interpretation to make it a nice universal feature that everyone can enjoy. That map is also at each of our primary entrances to the grounds, and you can see a detail here of how we addressed it. We have the full map, so you can see, you know, where your route is from point A to point B. We have our primary arrows to which direction to head, and if that's not an accessible route, you can see that second entrance, the Capitol Visitor Center, shows you that the accessible route is actually behind you. And again, we have interpretive elements relative to each location, and so it kind of becomes also an interpretive feature that can be enjoyed across the grounds. So once you get past that map reader and you can't memorize the map, it's still pretty confusing. And so we have wayfinding markers that were installed at every point of decision. You remember all the paths across the grounds are beautiful, but trying to decide which one's accessible and which one's not can get pretty confusing. And you can see we have directions to and from every major entrance and all of our primary buildings from wherever you are. They can be viewed as you approach them, and also from the side for people with visual impairments. And here's an example of another one from both sides of a kind of fork in the road. And you can see the right image in particular. If you were arriving in a wheelchair, you might intuitively think, well, the right must be the accessible route, but the left is accessible, and that's where you need to head to get to our accessible entrance. And at each point, you are guided in the right direction. These were also designed to be, because they're on historic grounds and we want them to not stick out like sore thumbs, they're useful at the point where you need them, at the juncture where you're needing to decide where to go. But they're also, we picked a color that would kind of blend in with the building and into the shadows, so they don't stick out. And in addition to the one you see here, which tells you to keep going forward, there's actually 5 more in this photo that kind of blend into the landscape. And here's another example. There's actually 6 wayfinding markers in here, and the one you see in front of you tells you to keep going forward. Don't turn right. And we also had some issues inside the building, especially with crowd control. And so at our elevators and our hearing rooms, we put signage that's prominent but not obtrusive, that reminds people to provide priority access for people with disabilities, so that everyone can have full access to the building. And one thing I forgot to mention is on our map readers, we also have a phone number to call people, because at the end of the day, people are still better than signs. The signs were a great improvement, but having the ability to call someone and having people in the building to assist people with their accessibility needs is ideal. And these signs really give someone authority to point out and say, sir, can you please let this person in the wheelchair on the elevator first? And so it kind of works with our people. We have a couple of projects in the pipeline to additionally approve beyond the ADA. One is we're working on an accessible drop-off location, which is closer to our north entrance with a shelter. And we're converting 2 of our lesser-used restrooms into family-use restrooms for families with small children and visitors who are accompanied by assistants. So we're always working to improve accessibility here at the Capitol. The job is never done. And that's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. And I actually think your presentation leads into a question that Mary Mulvihill had from Maryland. And we're running a little over time, but for anyone who'd like to stay on, I'll pose this question, and then we will, if there's any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and NCSL staff will respond, as well as our presenters, to you personally. But the question Mary poses is, to what extent, if any, have you extended accessibility goals and principles to your state capitol visitor and tour programs? And Kevin, I think wayfinding is part of that story. So for our panelists, I'd be curious about experiences you've had. Wyoming has not actually embarked on our interpretive plans and formalizing our tour programs yet, so it's something we are definitely going to take to heart, and I would love to learn more too.
Well, I wish our curator of the Capitol was here, who's in charge of our visitor services, but I know we're always looking at, multiple languages, including sign language, and you can schedule a tour that addresses any of your needs. We basically have on our website is a key tool, is our website for pre-planning, and there's a phone number there. And, if you have any needs ahead of time, you can call and plan and let us know who's coming and what the needs are, and we can accommodate any sort of issues that anyone may have.
One of the things, Wendy, this is David Hart. One of the things that Paul and I do is we always try to trace out the pathway that the visitors will take, and we work diligently to try to make sure, as we've shown you, either through universal design or through other means, as to how to get all the people to a location where they can start a tour. In Utah, when we completed the restoration and they had the grand opening, they had a system that people could download on their phone, and then as they moved through the building, they would be able to sync up with where they were in the building, and it would then tell them about the item in front of them, or the thing they were looking at. I believe there was a part of that where you could push a button and it would kind of give you a pre-recorded message. I know in Minnesota we had worked very closely with the blind, the Department of the Blind, and some of the other people about the different abilities that were needed to be accommodated. They had a tour program that was trying very hard to try to incorporate some of these things, and I'm not sure how that worked out. And then in Wyoming, we went so far as to do some initial planning with the interpretive plan, and as Wendy mentioned, that has not been implemented yet, but there were several ideas that came forward from having displays that people would be able to push a button and have it speak to them about certain things. Of course, Braille would be incorporated, as well as there was a way for people to kind of find their way through the building. But like she said, none of that has been incorporated at this point.
Great. Thank you, David. We are running out of time, but if anyone would like, please feel free to send questions. I'm also curious, we focused a lot on mobility issues today, a little bit on hearing impaired accommodations, but I'm curious if anyone in the audience has encountered any other types of accommodations that you'd like to bring up, or questions that you have about other challenges that the panel hasn't addressed. And we're happy to talk about those too, because again, the goal is to make the building welcome and easy to use for all of our citizens. And if you don't have questions, I would just like to remind you that this webinar was recorded today and will be made available on NCSL's website in the next week. And we will go ahead and wrap this up, and we thank you all for joining today. And Kevin and David and Paul, I can't thank you enough. There's so much content here and so much more we could explore, but what a wonderful way to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the ADA in our symbols of democracy, and how we can all think about the principles of universal design and how we make our buildings allow folks to have the same experience from any perspective. So I appreciate y'all joining today, and have a great weekend. And that concludes our webinar.